Discarded royal blood flows through winter-chapped hands. Julian huddles beneath Amsterdam's unforgiving bridges, his noble eyes betraying a heritage invisible to passing crowds. In Living in Shadows, a chance encounter with power illuminates what darkness has concealed for decades. Birthright denied, legacy stolen, bloodline severed. The crown's forgotten son awakens. Julian pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as the December wind swept mercilessly across Amsterdam's canals, carrying with it the casual indifference of a city that had forgotten him, or perhaps had never truly seen him at all. The water beneath the bridge, where he had made his temporary shelter, reflected fractured images of the historical buildings that lined the canal, their golden lights creating a mockery of warmth that never reached the shadowed alcove he called home. His fingers, once trained to handle fine crystal and fountain pens, now struggled to maintain their grip on a worn paper cup as he collected the sparse change offered by passing tourists who avoided his gaze as though his misfortune might somehow be contagious, transferable through the simple act of acknowledgement or the momentary connection of eye contact. His life had become a series of invisible moments, hours that blended into days and weeks, marked only by the changing patterns of pedestrian traffic and the shifting angles of sunlight that occasionally warmed his face when the clouds parted enough to allow it. Despite the crushing weight of his circumstances, there remained about Julian an innate dignity that no amount of hardship had managed to erode. A certain way of holding his shoulders, of meeting the eyes of those who dared to look at him directly, that spoke of an upbringing at odds with the reality he now inhabited. The shelter where he occasionally sought respite during the coldest nights was a place of last resort rather than comfort, its crowded quarters and institutional regulations a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the life he should have known. From the birthright that had been systematically erased from public record through carefully orchestrated deceptions and the deliberate manipulation of his father's final wishes. On this particular morning, as frost formed intricate patterns on the underside of the bridge and the early light illuminated the city with a pale, ethereal glow, Julian emerged from his makeshift shelter with a quiet determination that had sustained him through years of hardship and invisibility. He carefully folded the tarpaulin that served as both mattress and blanket, tucking it into the waterproof bag that contained his few remaining possessions, a change of clothes kept meticulously clean despite his circumstances, a dog-eared photograph with edges softened by years of handling, a small notebook filled with handwritten memories that served as his personal proof of an identity the world had conspired to erase, and a silver pocket watch with an engraved coat of arms, the sole tangible connection to a father who had died before he could acknowledge his illegitimate son publicly. The shelter where he would spend the day volunteering stood 6 blocks away, a journey that Julian made with practiced efficiency, navigating the gradually awakening streets with the invisibility that years of homelessness had taught him. There was a certain irony in his situation that was not lost on him, that he, a man with no home of his own, would spend his days helping to provide food and temporary comfort to others in similar circumstances. Yet there was also a profound satisfaction in the work, in the small moments of connection and the opportunity to exercise skills from his former life. His organizational abilities, his talent for calming agitated individuals with nothing more than his presence and well-chosen words, the fluency in 5 languages that occasionally startled the shelter's regular staff but proved invaluable when communicating with the international population that found themselves adrift in Amsterdam's otherwise prosperous streets. The shelter's director, a compassionate woman named Marike, who had never questioned Julian's background but seemed to instinctively recognize that there was more to his story than was immediately apparent, greeted him with a warm smile as he entered through the service entrance, and hung his coat on the designated hook that had become unofficially his over the past 3 years. "We're expecting a visitor today," she informed him as he washed his hands at the industrial sink, preparing to help with breakfast service. "Some corporate CEO doing community outreach, probably for tax purposes or PR. Would you mind showing him around later? You explain our work better than anyone else, and I think your perspective would be valuable." Julian nodded his agreement, unaware that this seemingly mundane request would become the catalyst for the unraveling of decades of carefully constructed deception and the beginning of his journey back to a world that had been stolen from him before he had ever truly known it. Alexander Vermeer straightened his Italian silk tie with practiced precision as his private driver navigated through Amsterdam's narrow streets toward the homeless shelter where his company's latest community outreach initiative would commence. At 60, the CEO of Vermeer International had accumulated the trappings of success that society deemed appropriate for a man of his position. The penthouse apartment overlooking the Amstel River, the vacation homes strategically positioned in Provence and the Swiss Alps, the carefully curated art collection that graced the walls of his corporate headquarters, yet he found himself increasingly questioning the substance beneath these symbols of achievement. His recent divorce, his third, had forced a kind of reckoning that all his wealth and influence could not forestall. The recognition that professional success had come at the expense of meaningful human connection, leaving him surrounded by advisors and subordinates, but fundamentally alone. The shelter, when they arrived, was not what Alexander had expected, neither the squalid, depressing institution he had unconsciously prepared himself to endure with stoic philanthropy, nor the efficiently clinical operation that would have reassured his corporate sensibilities. Instead, he found a place of surprising warmth, where pragmatic necessity coexisted with genuine care, evident in small touches that transformed what could have been merely functional into something approaching home. The fresh flowers on the communal tables, the carefully labeled personal storage spaces, the absence of the institutional smell he had braced himself to encounter. The director who greeted him, a forthright woman whose handshake was firm and whose eyes evaluated him without deference to his status, introduced herself as Marieke, before explaining that one of their volunteers would be providing him with a tour of the facilities and an explanation of their operations and needs. "Julian will show you around," she said, gesturing toward a man who was completing the breakfast service, his movements efficient as he cleared plates and exchanged quiet words with the shelter's residents. Alexander's initial assessment was cursory, a homeless man himself, judging by the worn but immaculately maintained clothing, probably in his mid-40s, with the leathered skin of someone who had spent too many years exposed to the elements. But as the man approached and their eyes met, Alexander felt an unexpected jolt of recognition that he couldn't immediately place. There was something in Julian's bearing, in the way he held himself and met Alexander's gaze directly, that spoke of a background at odds with his current circumstances, something that resonated with Alexander's own experiences in the upper echelons of European society, where certain mannerisms and expectations were ingrained from childhood. "Mr. Vermeer," Julian greeted him, his accent impeccable, his Dutch carrying the slight inflection of someone educated in the country's most exclusive institutions. "Thank you for your interest in our work here." The incongruity struck Alexander immediately, the contrast between the man's evident education and refinement and his weathered appearance, the casual use of "our" that identified him not as an employee but as a community member, the natural authority with which he conducted himself despite his circumstances. As Julian led him through the facility, explaining the shelter's operations with the precision and insight of someone who understood both its daily functions and its broader societal context, Alexander found himself increasingly intrigued by the puzzle this man presented. a puzzle that became even more complex when Julian seamlessly switched to fluent French to translate for a newly arrived refugee, then to German to clarify a question from another volunteer, exhibiting the kind of multilingual fluency that came only from an elite European education. Their tour concluded in the shelter's small administrative office, where Julian outlined the organization's financial needs and operational challenges, with the analytical clarity of someone who had once navigated far more complex organizational structures. "The most significant barrier we face," he explained, "is not merely financial resources, though those are certainly limited, but rather the systematic failures that create homelessness in the first place. The lack of transitional support for those leaving institutional care, the inadequate mental health services, the bureaucratic complexities that make it nearly impossible to reintegrate into formal society once you've fallen outside its parameters." He spoke not with the defensive anger Alexander might have expected, but with the measured analysis of someone who understood systems from the inside, who could see their flaws with the clarity of both personal experience and intellectual comprehension. Alexander found himself responding not with the practiced philanthropy he had prepared, the predetermined donation, the carefully calibrated expressions of concern, but with genuine engagement, drawn into a discussion that quickly evolved beyond the shelter's immediate needs to broader questions of social policy and systemic reform. As their conversation continued, he became increasingly certain that Julian was not who he appeared to be, or rather, that what he appeared to be now was only a fraction of who he had once been. When Marieke interrupted them to inform Julian that his assistance was needed with a new arrival, Alexander found himself reluctant to conclude their interaction, compelled by both professional curiosity and personal interest to understand more about this enigmatic man whose intelligence and dignity had somehow survived what must have been a catastrophic fall from grace. The revelation came 3 weeks later, after Alexander had returned to the shelter multiple times, under the increasingly thin pretense of monitoring his company's volunteer program. In reality, he found himself drawn back by an inexplicable fascination with Julian, whose composed demeanor and evident intelligence presented a puzzle that Alexander's analytical mind could not resist attempting to solve. On this particular evening, he had arrived after the shelter's dinner service had concluded, finding Julian alone in the small reading room where donated books lined mismatched shelves and a few comfortable chairs provided a rare space for privacy and reflection. The winter storm that had descended upon Amsterdam had driven even the most resistant of the city's homeless population indoors, and the shelter hummed with the quiet sounds of temporary community, muted conversations, the occasional burst of laughter, the clinking of dishes being washed in the industrial kitchen. "You keep returning," Julian observed without looking up from the book in his hands, a well-worn copy of Dutch constitutional history that seemed incongruous with his current circumstances, yet entirely in keeping with the man Alexander was beginning to know. "I doubt our humble operation requires such close oversight from someone at your level." There was no accusation in his tone, merely a statement of fact, followed by a question that caught Alexander off guard with its directness. "What is it you're looking for, Mr. Vermeer?" The simplicity of the question stripped away the polite fictions that had allowed their continued interaction, forcing Alexander to acknowledge, at least to himself, that his interest had evolved beyond professional philanthropy into something more personal, a recognition of something in Julian that resonated with his own experience of navigating the rarefied world of European power and privilege, albeit from vastly different positions within that hierarchy. "I'm trying to understand who you are," Alexander admitted, taking the seat across from Julian, the expensive wool of his bespoke overcoat contrasting sharply with the threadbare upholstery of the charity shop armchair. Your education, your mannerisms, your understanding of systems that most people never see from the inside, they don't align with." He gestured vaguely at their surroundings, at the shelter that provided Julian with his only semblance of stability, avoiding the direct statement that might have seemed accusatory or condescending. Julian's smile in response held a complexity of emotion that Alexander couldn't fully decipher. A mixture of resignation, bitter amusement, and perhaps a hint of relief at being truly seen for the first time in what must have been years. He closed the book carefully, his fingers tracing the embossed title with a familiarity that suggested he had read it many times before. "Who I Am," Julian repeated softly, his gaze focused somewhere beyond the shelter's walls, beyond the present moment, into a past that Alexander could only guess at. "That's a more complicated question than you might imagine." He was silent for a long moment, seeming to weigh some internal decision before reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrawing the small notebook that Alexander had occasionally seen him writing in during quiet moments. From between its pages, Julian extracted a photograph. Its edges softened and creased from years of handling, and passed it across the small distance between them. Alexander accepted it with careful hands, conscious of its evident importance, and found himself looking at an image of a much younger Julian standing beside an older man whose face triggered an immediate sense of recognition. A face that had appeared in newspapers and official state photographs throughout Alexander's youth and early adulthood. Prince Willem. Alexander identified the man automatically, the realization forming even as he spoke the name, his gaze shifting rapidly between the photograph and Julian's face. Recognizing now the similarities that had previously registered only as a vague sense of familiarity. The distinctive shape of the eyes, the proud line of the jaw, features that belonged to one of the Netherlands' most beloved royal figures, a man known as much for his humanitarian work as for his position within the royal family. Julian nodded, reclaiming the photograph with careful fingers, his expression guarded as he gauged Alexander's reaction to this revelation. "My father," he confirmed quietly, the words hanging in the air between them, laden with implications that Alexander's mind was already racing to process. Implications of royal blood, of illegitimacy, of inheritance potentially denied. "He acknowledged me privately," Julian continued, his voice steady despite the evident weight of the memories he was sharing, "but never publicly. My mother was a graduate student he met during his university years, brilliant, beautiful, utterly unsuitable for a prince of the realm, according to the royal advisors. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was offered a considerable settlement to disappear quietly, to terminate the pregnancy or, failing that, to ensure that the child never knew his heritage." The bitterness in his voice was controlled, refined by years of reflection rather than raw with fresh anger. "She refused the termination but accepted the financial settlement, believing it would secure my future. What she didn't anticipate was how thoroughly the royal machinery could erase inconvenient truths when necessary, how easily bank accounts could be frozen, documents could disappear, and a young woman with a child could be discredited if she attempted to assert claims against one of Europe's oldest monarchies. Alexander listened with growing comprehension as Julian detailed the systematic dismantling of his mother's life. The academic position that had mysteriously evaporated, the rental agreements suddenly terminated, the subtle but relentless pressure that had gradually isolated her from colleagues and friends, until, finally, her death in what was officially recorded as an accident, but which Julian clearly believed had been either suicide or something more sinister. "I was 15 when she died," he said, his gaze fixed on the photograph as though drawing strength from the frozen moment it captured. Old enough to understand what we had lost, young enough to be consigned to a system that had no interest in or knowledge of my true identity. By the time I was legally an adult, able to begin my own investigation into my heritage, I discovered that the evidence had been methodically erased. My mother's correspondence with my father, the financial records that would have proven the settlement payments, even my own birth certificate had been altered to list my father as unknown. The winter storm outside intensified, wind driving snow against the shelter's windows in a rhythmic pattern that punctuated Julian's narrative as he explained how he had eventually managed to establish contact with his father years later, arranging clandestine meetings that had culminated in Prince Willem's promise to formally acknowledge his son and provide for his inheritance, a promise cut short by the prince's unexpected death in a sailing accident before the necessary legal documents could be executed. "There was evidence," Julian said, his voice dropping lower as he reached the heart of his story. "Documents my father had prepared, proof of my identity and his intentions, possibly even a formal amendment to his will. But after his death, when I attempted to come forward, I found that his private study had been thoroughly cleared, his personal papers either destroyed or sealed by royal decree, and any mention of my existence systematically expunged from the record." Alexander's mind, trained through decades of complex business negotiations to identify leverage points and strategic openings, was already racing ahead to potential avenues of investigation, to resources that might be deployed in service of uncovering the truth. "And you've been living like this ever since?" he asked, gesturing to their surroundings, trying to reconcile the man before him with the story he had just shared, a story of royal blood and systematic betrayal that seemed more suited to a historical drama than to the reality of modern European governance. Julian's response was tempered with a dignity that Alexander found himself increasingly admiring. "I exhausted my resources pursuing legal channels until it became clear that I was fighting an institution designed to protect itself, not to deliver justice. When the last appeal failed, when the last door closed, I found myself without the credentials or connections to rebuild a conventional life. The irony of a homeless prince is not lost on me, I assure you. The conversation might have ended there, might have remained nothing more than a tragic anecdote shared in a moment of unusual candor, had Alexander not found himself inexplicably compelled to utter the words that would irrevocably alter both their lives. What if we were to reopen the investigation, with my resources, with connections that extend beyond those you could access on your own? What if we could find the evidence your father intended to leave?" The question hung between them, an offering and a challenge both, as the storm outside reached its crescendo and the shelter settled into its nighttime rhythms around them. Julian's response, when it came, was measured but tinged with an emotion that Alexander recognized from his own business conquests, the cautious awakening of hope in terrain long abandoned to defeat. "That would depend, Mr. Vermeer, on why you would choose to involve yourself in such a potentially controversial undertaking. What would you stand to gain from helping restore a forgotten prince to his rightful place?" The investigation began cautiously, with Alexander leveraging his considerable network to make discreet inquiries while maintaining the public fiction that Julian remained simply a volunteer at the homeless shelter who had captured the philanthropic interest of a wealthy CEO. Behind this careful facade, however, a methodical campaign was taking shape. A campaign built upon Alexander's decades of experience navigating the intersections of business and political power throughout Europe, and his intimate understanding of where pressure might most effectively be applied to yield information that others wished to keep hidden. Their unlikely partnership, formalized with a handshake in the shelter's reading room rather than with contracts and lawyers, combined Julian's detailed knowledge of his own history with Alexander's resources and strategic acumen in a way that neither man could have anticipated during their initial encounters. The first breakthrough came through an elderly former servant of the royal household, a woman named Helena, who had served as Prince Willem's personal valet for over 3 decades and who had been abruptly pensioned off following his death under circumstances that, in retrospect, suggested she might have known more than was convenient for those managing the prince's affairs. Alexander arranged the meeting at his penthouse apartment, creating a neutral territory where the woman's appearance would not trigger the surveillance mechanisms that Julian was convinced continued to monitor any direct approaches to those connected with his father. Helena arrived with the careful dignity of one accustomed to moving through spaces of power while remaining deliberately invisible within them. Her assessment of the penthouse's luxury, automatic but unarticulated, her gaze sharpening with interest when she was introduced to Julian, studying his features with the experienced eye of someone who had observed his father at close quarters for most of his adult life. "You have his eyes," she said finally, the simple observation carrying more weight than any DNA test could have provided. "And the way you hold your head when you're listening, that's him entirely." Her testimony, delivered over tea served in Alexander's finest porcelain, provided the first external confirmation of what Julian had long maintained, that Prince Willem had indeed been preparing to acknowledge his illegitimate son in the months before his death, that he had been meeting privately with his personal legal advisors without the knowledge of the broader royal council, and that he had maintained a hidden safe in his private study, where he kept documents too sensitive for the official royal archives. "He changed the combination the week before he died," Helena recalled, her weathered hands cradling the delicate teacup with the unconscious care of someone trained to handle objects of value and historical significance. He was concerned about something or someone. He didn't confide in me directly, but I overheard enough to know that he feared his intentions regarding you were known to people who opposed them. "Did you?" The information about the safe provided a tangible focus for their investigation, a specific objective around which Alexander could organize the next phase of their campaign. Through a series of carefully orchestrated business meetings and social engagements, he managed to secure an introduction to one of the architectural preservationists currently overseeing renovations to the historical wing of the royal residence where Prince Willem's private study had been located. The pretext was a potential corporate donation to the preservation fund, but the true objective was to obtain the original architectural plans of the prince's quarters. Plans that might reveal the location of a safe that had been deliberately omitted from the official inventory of the room's contents following Willem's death. The preservationist, flattered by the attention of such a prominent potential donor and encouraged by Alexander's genuine interest in historical architecture, eventually provided access to the detailed blueprints that had been created during the last major renovation of the wing, some 40 years earlier. Julian spent hours poring over these plans in Alexander's home office, correlating them with his memories of the few clandestine visits he had made to his father's private study, searching for inconsistencies or anomalies that might indicate the presence of a hidden compartment. It was during this painstaking analysis that he identified a discrepancy between the documented dimensions of the study and those of the adjacent rooms, a difference of approximately 60 centimeters that suggested the existence of a space concealed behind what appeared on the plans to be a solid wall lined with bookshelves. "It would be consistent with what I remember," Julian explained, his finger tracing the relevant section of the blueprint, his expression animated with a focused intensity that Alexander had not previously witnessed. There was a particular section of the bookshelves that my father always approached when retrieving or storing documents he didn't show to anyone else. I assumed it was simply a drawer disguised to match the shelving, but it could easily have concealed a safe of significant size. The question of how to access this potential hiding place presented a formidable challenge, one that required Alexander to deploy both his legitimate business connections and some of the more questionable contacts he had accumulated throughout decades of international commerce. Through a carefully constructed chain of introductions and financial incentives, he eventually secured the cooperation of a junior member of the Royal Security Detail, a young man whose gambling debts had created a vulnerability that Alexander exploited with the calculated precision of a corporate takeover. The security officer, motivated by a combination of financial desperation and Alexander's assurance that they sought only to recover personal items that rightfully belonged to Julian, rather than anything of official state significance, provided them with temporary access credentials to the historical wing during a period when the renovation work had been temporarily suspended for a state function in the residence's main reception areas. The night of their covert entry into Prince Willem's former study was characterized by a tension that neither man acknowledged directly. The tension of knowing that discovery would mean not only the failure of their quest, but potentially serious legal consequences for them both. Julian, dressed in the uniform of the renovation crew that Alexander had procured through his architectural preservation contacts, moved through the dimly lit corridors of the royal residence with a strange combination of familiarity and alienation, navigating spaces that represented both his birthright and the systematic erasure of his identity. The study itself, when they finally gained entry, using the security codes provided by their reluctant accomplice, presented a painful contrast to Julian's memories. The warm, personalized space of his recollection replaced by an impersonal museum setting where his father's possessions had been arranged with curatorial precision rather than practical use, creating a public narrative of the prince that carefully excluded any hint of his secret son's existence. Working with the focused efficiency demanded by their limited time frame, Julian located the section of bookshelves that had featured in his memories while Alexander stood watch near the door, alert for any sign that their presence had been detected. The mechanism, when Julian finally identified it, was elegantly simple. A particular volume that, when pulled to a specific angle, triggered the release of a hidden panel, revealing exactly the kind of safe that Helena had described. The combination, however, presented a momentary impasse until Julian, drawing on Helena's comment about the prince changing it shortly before his death, tried the numeric representation of his own birth date, a combination that caused the safe's locking mechanism to release with a soft but distinct click that seemed to echo in the silent room like a proclamation. Inside lay exactly what they had hoped to find: a sealed envelope containing a formally executed amendment to Prince Willem's will, explicitly acknowledging Julian as his biological son. Legal documentation establishing his right to a portion of the royal inheritance, and a personal letter addressed to Julian that brought tears to his eyes as he scanned its contents in the subdued light of their flashlights. The documents, carefully secured in the specialized container Alexander had brought for this purpose, represented more than legal evidence. They were the tangible manifestation of a father's intention to acknowledge his son, to provide for his future, and to correct, at least partially, the injustice that had shaped Julian's life. As they carefully restored the study to its undisturbed state, erasing all evidence of their presence according to the meticulous plan Alexander had developed, Julian felt the weight of decades of uncertainty and invisibility beginning to lift, replaced by the tentative emergence of a new reality, one in which his identity was no longer a secret to be hidden or denied, but a truth that carried with it both validation and daunting new responsibilities. The journey back through the royal residence's shadowed corridors and out through the service entrance, where Alexander's driver waited with carefully concealed impatience, was conducted in a silence that reflected the magnitude of what they had accomplished and the irrevocable changes it would bring to both their lives. It was only when they were safely ensconced in Alexander's penthouse, the documents spread across the polished surface of his desk, and the first light of dawn beginning to illuminate the Amsterdam skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, that the full implications of their discovery began to take shape in concrete terms. The amendment to Prince Willem's will, executed with all the necessary legal formalities and bearing the signatures of witnesses whose credentials were beyond reproach, established Julian's right to a specific portion of his father's personal estate, an inheritance that, while carefully structured to avoid any claim on official royal properties or titles, nevertheless represented substantial wealth in terms of private landholdings, investment portfolios, and historical collections acquired by the prince throughout his lifetime. The accompanying legal documentation provided irrefutable evidence of Julian's paternity, including DNA test results that had been conducted privately and without the knowledge of the broader royal apparatus, creating a foundation for legal recognition that would be difficult, if not impossible, for even the most determined royal advisors to dismiss or discredit. The personal letter, which Julian finally allowed Alexander to read as the morning light strengthened and the reality of their success solidified around them, revealed a father's complex emotions toward the son he had acknowledged too late and too privately. Regret for years of absence, pride in the man Julian had become, despite the obstacles placed in his path, and a clear-eyed recognition of the forces that would align against him should he attempt to claim his rightful place. "I have arranged matters as best I can to ensure your inheritance," Prince Willem had written in the precise, elegant script that Julian remembered from their brief shared moments. "But I harbor no illusions about the resistance you will face. Remember always that your value lies not in titles or possessions, but in the integrity with which you navigate the challenges before you. The blood that flows through your veins carries with it both privilege and responsibility. Choose wisely, which you will emphasize in the life you build from this point forward." As Julian carefully refolded the letter along creases that suggested it had been read and considered many times before being sealed away, Alexander recognized in his expression the emergence of something new, a sense of purpose and possibility that transcended the immediate triumph of their discovery and looked forward to the complex process of reclamation that still lay ahead.